Imagine a world caught in the middle of relentless conflict, where faith and survival clash in brutal battles. The Crusades, epic and tragic, are often portrayed as wars between Christianity and Islam. Yet what if I told you that the story is incomplete? That in the shadows of these bloody campaigns, another tale unfolds. A story of Eastern Christians who suffered, adapted, and transformed in ways seldom discussed. What impact did these crusading tides have on their ancient communities, their beliefs, and their very identity? Join us as we unravel the hidden legacy of the Crusades on Eastern Christianity and reveal the deep, often overlooked scars left behind. The impact of the Crusades on Eastern Christianity. The bizarre medieval military campaign known as the Crusades was fruitful in terms of astonishing events and unproductive in terms of beneficial outcomes for the parties involved. The main parties involved, Western Christians and Eastern Muslims, were able to record a few items on their balance sheets. But these were nothing compared to the countless losses of life, property, and damage to spiritual life. On the material side, Europeans conquered new territories, even if only for a short time, expanded their commercial markets, discovered new tastes in food and cloth, and brought home hitherto unknown agricultural and industrial products. The Muslims, divided into the Seljuk Turks, the Sunni Arab emirs, and the dissident Shiites, who facilitated the first Frankish conquests, witnessed a revival of the spirit of early Islam and entered a new era of political unity. This movement culminated in the life and achievements of the greatest and bravest hero, according to Islamic chronicles, Salah al-Din Ayyub. But for the third group involved, the Christians of Syria and Egypt, who were in no way responsible for this struggle, the bottom line of their balance sheets remained almost empty. The Crusades disillusioned and disempowered them. Their negative consequences destroyed a large part of them. Ironically, this adventure, initially born out of a desire to defend the Christian world, came close to destroying the eastern wing of Christianity. The traces of these anti-Christian sentiments have not yet faded from memory. Indeed, the spirit of the Crusades to fight against the French and British mandates in Syria and Iraq, and against the Anglo-French offensive on Egypt and Suez, was kept alive until the mid-20th century. The Crusades also had harmful retrospective effects. Syrian Christians, who for 2 centuries prior to the Crusades had acted as entrepreneurs of classical and positive sciences and liaison officers for scientific exchange between Christian Europe and Muslim Asia, realized that their usefulness was over. Through the mediation of these Christians, their Muslim neighbors had uncovered the Hellenic and Roman legacy. At the end of the 13th century, when the final curtain fell on the play of the Crusades, this source of cultural exchange was cut off. In Syria, a vast geographical area including Lebanon and Palestine, the Christian minorities must have amounted to a majority of the population. In the cities, the population was predominantly Muslim. In northern Syria and Cilicia, Chukurova region, the strongest elements were Gregorian Armenian, North Syrian Assyrian, and Greek Orthodox Greek. The Maronites dominated northern Lebanon. Orthodox Greeks probably made up half the population of Palestine, and in Egypt the Copts constituted a small but influential minority. Muslims undoubtedly ruled everywhere, but Christian rights and responsibilities were clearly spelled out in the Quran and Islamic law and were generally respected. Christians generally adapted to their status as second-class citizens, but the intervention of the Christian element from the West was a disturbing factor. The Crusader military class recognized to a certain extent the importance of local co-religionists as allies, but the clergy did not. For the Latin Church, all Eastern Christians were separatists, if not heretics, who needed to be reunited with the Mother Church, Rome. After crossing the Taurus Mountains and before turning southward, a detachment of the Crusader armies from southern Italy under the command of the Norman Tancred, left the main route and headed west into Cilicia, whose population was predominantly Gregorian Armenian and Orthodox Greek Christians. Here, Tancred captured Tarsus. At the same time, another group, led by the future king of Jerusalem, Baudouin du Boulogne, turned east, attracted by the capital of an Armenian dynasty, Urfa, Edessa, Ruha. The ruler of Urfa was Toros, of the great Rupenian dynasty. Armenian refugees fleeing the destruction of their principality, further east by the Seljuks, scattered westward and formed the basis of Lesser Armenia, or Cilician Armenia. Although theologically monophysite, the Gregorian Church was not initially considered heretical. For the Armenians, the Turks were enemy number one, and their persecutors, the Eastern Romans, enemy number two. Taurus welcomed Baudouin with great affection, showed all hospitality to his soldiers, and officially declared him his son and heir. The adopted Baudouin succeeded his father a month later. Among the other Christian communities, the Armenians were unique in having memories of an independent past, a national tradition, a feudal structure, and a class of nobles who could make treaties, marriages, and allies with the Franks. Baudouin set an important example by marrying an Armenian princess. Many Armenian princesses dreamed of being in the courts of the Crusader Principality of Antioch and the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Latin Crusader army first deprived the native Christians they encountered of their lands, while the Latin Crusader clergy pressured the native clergy to recognize the supremacy of the Roman Church. Later, the major bishops of Edessa, Urfa, and Cilicia, probably acting more out of self-interest than sincere conviction, took the final step and sought full communion with the Latin Church. In fact, they had been preceded by a Catholic, Gregorios II, who had negotiated for papal recognition and received the episcopal see. In this way, a destructive element was introduced into the Armenian community, whose main unifying force for its survival as a nation was the Church. The Archbishop of Tarsus, Nerses of Lampros, persuaded the Armenian Prince of Cilicia, Leon II, to support the Catholic cause. Leon's greatest ambition was to be crowned king, which he achieved with the patronage of the Franks. Even then, not all the community followed suit, but eventually a new sect, the Armenian Catholic Church, was born. The main Christian element in northern Syria was the Jacobites, Syrians, rather than the Gregorians. However, while the Armenians were confined to the northern region, the West Syrians spread and dominated the interior. As proud representatives of a tradition older than that of Rome and the East, they had reason to keep their distance. The Syriac they spoke and worshipped was the Aramaic dialect used by Jesus Christ. But since the Romans and the Eastern Romans had treated the Syriacs as heretics, they, along with their Armenian neighbors, now sought closer relations with the Latins, Crusaders, as a measure to protect their own lives, if not their own souls. The Seljuks recognized the supremacy of these Christians in northern Syria. They patronized a patriarchate in Antioch and a bishopric in Urfa. The Syriac aristocracy was exclusively clerical, and this class and the people beyond them had as little affection for the newly arrived Armenians as they had for their Eastern Roman overlords. The West Syrians also had an archbishop in Jerusalem. This office was vacant when the Crusaders entered the city in 1099. The archbishop had fled the city when the Seljuks captured Jerusalem. The Crusader administrators, sensing that these Christians would be potential allies, did not hesitate to put the empty church properties under the authority of the archbishop upon his return. They allowed the bishop's clergy to perform their religious rites. The wise Syriac Michael the Syriac, the Jacobite patriarch of Antioch, reports that the Franks were never difficult in matters of religious faith. But there is also evidence to believe that the Frankish clergy put enough pressure on their Syriac colleagues to achieve the desired results. Michael the Syriac's successor, Ignatius II, traveled to Jerusalem and, through the Dominican provincial administrator, declared his allegiance to Rome and reiterated his obedience to Pope Innocent IV. The union was naturally not as welcome as the earlier union with the Armenians. It divided the community, creating a new group called the Syriac Catholic Church. When the Crusaders arrived, the Orthodox Greeks were the most numerous Christian community. They were the main element of the population of Cilicia, as well as in many cities in Syria, especially in the Greek-founded cities of Antioch, Silifke, and Lazikia, Laodicea, Latakia. Orthodox Greeks were the favorites of Eastern Rome. Antioch, one of the first centers of Christians to come to mind, maintained its position as a stronghold of orthodoxy even under Seljuk rule. Their religious rites were the same as those of the Eastern Romans, hence they were called Melkites, pro-ruler, pro-emperor. This strange name was later given to those Orthodox who united with the Roman Church. Of all the Eastern Christian sects, they were the least responsive to the Latin expansion. The newly arrived Crusaders established a rival Latin patriarchate in Antioch, right next to the Greek patriarchate. They offered to recognize the autonomy of the Orthodox Church, with its internal hierarchy and Greek religious customs. Patriarch David then accepted the terms of the agreement offered by the Latins, but his successor rejected the authority of the Pope. He was therefore excommunicated and exiled by his Latin rival. Damascus became the new center of the Greek Patriarchate in Syria. Since the end of the last century, its inhabitants became the indigenous Arabic-speaking inhabitants of the region. When the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, they found that the city's leading clergy had all fled to Cyprus from Seljuk oppression. They wasted no time in confiscating the vacant properties and replacing the clergy with Latins. The newly established Latin Patriarchate was perhaps acceptable to the Arabic-speaking members of the community, but the rest of the Greek clergy found it difficult to accept. The Franks abolished all non-Latin religious rites in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The spontaneous light of the lamps on the Greek altar was extinguished on the Saturday night before Easter, an absolute sign of God's wrath. The Greek clergy prayed for the victory of Saladin Ayyubid over the Crusaders, and when he succeeded in 1887, he restored the Greek Patriarchate with all its property to its owners. The lamps on the altar of the Holy Sepulchre began to emit light by themselves again. That Patriarchate, with its Hellenic-speaking clergy, continues to exist in the Holy City, Jerusalem, to this day. Among the various Christian denominations in the region, the Maronites were a minority, limited in number and area of settlement. The Maronites emerged as a sect in northern Syria in the 5th century, displaced by the neighboring Jacobites, who spoke and wrote the same language, but differed from them in their Christological views. Members of this sect took refuge in the fortified places of the North Lebanon mountain range and developed a sense of nationality, faced with the problem of survival in a savage environment. This community, a minority in the lowlands, became the largest and most cohesive Christian community in the mountainous region. The Eastern Romans were no more tolerant of the Maronites than they were of their Muslim neighbors. The Crusader historian William, Runciman 459, claims that the Maronites, who numbered 40,000 and practiced monothelitism, rejected heresy in 1180 and re-affiliated with the Catholic Church. However, Maronite adherents consistently rejected the accusations of heresy. They did not consider themselves to be members of the Eastern churches, Uniates, who recognized the authority of the Pope but retained their own rites and customs. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that reconciliation between Rome and the Lebanese National Church began at the time of the Crusades and culminated in unification in 1736. First contact was made with these Christian Highlanders as the crusading crowds marched exhausted along the Lebanese coast. They recognized each other as natural allies. The Maronites provided the Crusaders with much-needed guides and supplies, and later equipped the Crusader, Latin, Kingdom of Jerusalem, with an archery unit that had proven itself on the battlefield. The Crusaders, in turn, granted the Maronites all the legal rights, religious and civil privileges of the Latin nobility. Thus began the traditional Frankish-Lebanese friendship that continues to this day. But the Maronites, as we shall see below, had to pay dearly for their relationship with the Crusaders. Egypt was fortunate enough to have a Greek Christian church in Alexandria, which played a role second only to Rome in the first 4 centuries of the Christian era. Among the fathers of that church was Clementus, who in about 200 founded a religious school of oral teaching. Under his pupil and successor Origen, this school gained distinction and was later headed by Athanasius, who earned the title of Father of Orthodoxy for his struggle against Arianism. But the local church was Coptic in its language and worship. Its Christology, teaching on Jesus, was monophysite, as was the Syrian church. We learn from Ibn Abd al-Hakam that when the Muslims conquered Egypt, 640, the bishop of the Copts instructed his flock not to resist. The reason for this is not difficult to guess. The Copts were subjected to religious persecution by the official Melkite Church. The situation became unresolvable when the then Eastern Roman Emperor Heraclius proclaimed a new doctrine, monothelitism, and ordered his viceroy in Egypt, Cyrus, to force the Copts to follow it. Cyrus was later, according to Coptic tradition, considered an enemy of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. When King Louis IX of France landed at Damietta in 1249, he was warmly welcomed by the Copts, but the Franks treated them no better than the Eastern Romans. To the Crusaders, Latins, the Copts were merely dissenters who needed to be converted to the true faith. In 1365, during a crusade targeting Alexandria, the city was temporarily captured, and Copts and Muslims were looted indiscriminately. If the Coptic Church was not as crippled by the Crusaders as its neighbors to the north, it was because its home country, Egypt, was not as involved in the events as Syria. Before the curtain came down on the final chapter in this East-West drama, or rather tragedy, the Mamluk sultans, the rulers of Egypt and Syria, had begun a policy of reprisals not only against the local Christians, but also against the Muslim minorities, who had sectarian differences. Sometimes these minorities cooperated with their enemies, the Mamluks, and sometimes they did not support them wholeheartedly. Even some Sunni Muslim cities and Arab tribes sometimes sought help from the Crusaders, Latins, and made alliances with the Crusader states. Among the military units of the Crusader, Latin states, was a cavalry unit called the Turcopole, sons of Turks Muslims. The Mamluks, fearing the return of the hated enemy, pursued a policy of retaliation, burning and destroying everything. Castles all along the Palestine-Lebanon coast were razed to the ground and their inhabitants expelled. Baybars was the hero of these campaigns. He forced the Nuceris, Alawites of the Lazikia region, to build mosques in their villages. The Druze of Lebanon were ordered to follow Sunni teachings and customs. Baybars led punitive expeditions against Cilician Armenia in the years 1600 to 6006, 1700 to 7703, and 1700 to 7755. Because the people of that region had collaborated not only with the Franks, but also with the Mongols. Thus, Armenian independence came to an end. After the Armenians, the Maronites also suffered a lot. Thousands of them fled to Cyprus. Their lifeless colony there still survived. Maronite territory, which had been divided by the Shiites, was subjected to 3 punitive expeditions by Khisravan between 1292 and 1306. The last one, organized by En-Nasir, almost exterminated the inhabitants. This sultan reintroduced outdated rules against dhimmis, non-Muslim subjects, including the wearing of different dress, and imposed them on all Christian subjects in Egypt and Syria. Syria and Palestine thus began to take on the Sunni Muslim character they have retained to this day. The Crusades may have ended centuries ago, but their impact on Eastern Christianity echoes even now. From forced conversions to cultural shifts, these campaigns left an indelible mark on Eastern Christian communities that reverberates through history. This isn't just a story of conquest, it's a story of resilience, of adapting to survive, and of faith tested in ways few could imagine. The legacy of these conflicts reminds us that history isn't always a tale of victories, but one of enduring strength. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share to keep exploring the hidden histories of our world.